First, we hope to be a continuing series of lectures sponsored by or hosted by the Professional Master's Programs in the Department of Earth and Environment. We're hoping to do in these talks is to highlight professionals in the earth and environmental realm. And to kick off this series, our first speaker is Charles Hernick, who is a very good friend of mine. But Charles has a long career in environmental consulting and now hopefully politics. So, You'll find out. So anyway, Charles is going to talk today about some of his experiences, and I think this will be valuable to those of you who are looking for careers in the environmental realm. And I won't delay any longer. Mr. Hernick.
Good. Professor Baldwin. A few of my former professors are here in the front too. Before we get started, and maybe even before I introduce myself, we're not going to go around the rooms and do individual introductions. But for folks that are, who are the folks that are more like international relations oriented? Who are the folks that are more environment oriented? And a handful of folks. What other groups do we have represented here? People who are just trying to get a college degree, whatever it is. I don't know. Okay, so my name is Charles Hernick. I graduated from the International Relations and Environmental Policy program back in 2006, and since then I worked for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Division for a year before joining Cadmus, which is this company with our shiny logo and whatnot right here. So Cadmus is an employee-owned company. We used to be considered a strict energy and environmental consulting shop, but have since expanded. We do a lot of work in public health. We do a lot of work internationally, which is where I focus all of my time in energy. And then through acquisition, we do a lot of demand-side management for energy utilities. We've got a climate change shop that is up and running, where we do a lot of the analytics for NOAA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so I can talk to you about these various elements of the company, but today I'm basically going to share with you a few short stories from my experience in the international realm. Hopefully that's appealing to the international folks. It focuses heavily on environment. This is an opinion piece. So feel free to raise your hand at any point in time, ask questions, so that this can be kind of more of a conversation and less me talking at you for an hour. Although this is a good break from studying, I hope. So international development, the essential goal is to get folks out of poverty, right? And so my biggest client is U.S. Agency for International Development. They have a noble goal that's here on the wall. The World Bank is also focused on utilizing money that comes from global superpowers to get folks out of extreme poverty. Poverty here on the slide is defined as $1.25 per day. That number has recently been revised, so it's now the poverty threshold is $1.90 per day. I think that my bottle of water costs more than that. So this is just a matter of perspective, and I think this is not new information for all of you, but to set the stage of what we're talking about when we're talking about development and which countries we're focusing on. So the thesis of the conversation, what I'd like to assert today, is that no one's against the environment. We're working hard, those of us in the environmental realm, but at the end of the day, everyone agrees, Republicans, Democrats, poor people, rich people, that fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters are a good thing, and that clean air is a good thing. They turned off the power plants recently in China for a couple of days, the skies went blue, and everybody thought that was good. Now, the problem, and as we know, is that the devil are in the details, and this is where regulation needs to come into play, various tools, analytic methods need to come in so that we can grow an economy and do a good job of it. And so the other component of it that I'll assert here is that sustainable development really depends on functioning democracies and economic opportunity. Without those two things, we have a real struggle, and we will be at a loss for conservation and from an environmental standpoint. And more than anything is that although the devils are in the detail, I steal a line here from Henry David Thoreau, which is to simplify, simplify. And that if it comes to good decision making, and many of you are in this room right now because you want to get jobs, and be influential, and do something good, or at least make some money, I'm a consultant. I make my money when I provide consulting expertise to decision makers in Washington, D.C., to decision makers in Tanzania, in Honduras, are two examples that we'll share. Senegal, whatever the country is, folks are interested in making a decision. They're not interested in having a long conversation with me. They need the information as quickly and succinctly as possible. And we need to focus on that. So, early on in my career, I went to Tanzania. Beautiful, beautiful country. How many people have seen like an elephant in the wild, like on safari? That is a huge percentage of people. That's fantastic. The rest of us have seen an elephant, in a zoo, hopefully, or at least watched a good movie, and if not, this is what an elephant looks like. So, elephant conservation is critical, and elephants are an endangered species in this part of Tanzania. And what I was brought in to do was provide advice to the U.S. government on what to do about development in a very specific area called the Kilimanjaro Valley in south central Tanzania. Now this area used to be the Garden of Eden. It's a huge, vast wetland, a Ramsar site, for those of you in the environmental world. That's a wetland of internationally recognized importance. Thousands of birds migrate there, it's unique habitat, it's pristine. Looks like the Garden of Eden, elephants are marching through. The problem is that from a development standpoint, the folks in this area are incredibly poor. Living on less than $2 a day, and trying their hardest to scrape by a living. This is subsistence living, so subsistence agriculture. They're growing rice to get by on a day-to-day basis. A lot of folks are flooding into the area because, it's wet. And that's good for rice, and rice is good for families. And so their population growth has doubled over the last 15 years, and the natural resources are stressed. So if you look at the various indicators, wildlife is going down, water is going down, land use is going up, trees are going down. So we have a real development situation here where we need to do something to improve the economy and protect these beautiful critters if that's what we're interested in doing. So we put together a really complicated map. And the whole area is probably 200 miles from the top of the map to the bottom. There's probably a scale here that I covered up somewhere. But you can see, you can get a relative size of the map. Something like that. So this is not what I'm most proud of in my consulting career, the map that we put up here. It contains a tremendous amount of information, which really does illustrate the various trade-offs that we're going to be making. On the top, you can see in green boxes, we have these game reserves. We've got other boxes, blue boxes to indicate the wetland area. This is, we can use GIS, and for those of you that are taking GIS classes, it's a tremendous way to put together information. But we need to put together the information in a way that's quick and accessible for folks to make decisions, so that folks can make a decision. At the end of the day, this analysis and the 200-page report that we came down to ecosystem services. And instead, what we should have done, and hindsight is 20/20, and so I can speak freely and be a critic of my own work here, we should have focused the analysis early on an ecosystem services review that would look at the relative trade-offs on how things are going to be used. Because here, folks were rushing to the region because there was water, abundant water for rice. That water, though, would also flow downriver. That water was an important source of nutrients for the prawn fisheries that were another big source of income. That source of water was an important source of water for those elephants in the Salou Game Reserve, which was right here, which is the biggest source of taxable income for the country of Tanzania. So at the end of the day, the analysis all came down to water. That didn't come through super clearly in the report that we were putting together, but it did come through in the conversations that we had later. So the reason I'm telling this story is because we need to know we need to think through a problem far enough ahead so that we can think through how to present it to the decision makers so that we can make a good decision at the end of the day. If folks have questions about this, I can tell you where this ended up going. The projects that the U.S. was going to help out with, these agriculture projects, ended up not happening. From my perspective, from an environmental standpoint, that's a tragedy. From an economic development standpoint, I think that's also a tragedy. But, so I wish that I could have helped make a better, faster decision. So, we'll talk about ecosystem services real briefly. What do people know about ecosystem services? Can someone define it for me? We need one bold person, otherwise we're going to be here all afternoon. Go ahead.
Sort of everything from economic to just like even, maybe there's religious tradition that comes from a certain natural landmark. Everything that the environment is offering that could be used in any capacity by people.
Yes. In fewer words, ecosystem services are the benefits that humans derive from ecosystems. And the benefits that humans derive from ecosystems are listed here on the board. And so they come in any range of things. And we can think of the analogy like we go to a coffee shop, and the service that I get from the coffee shop or the good that I get from the coffee shop is the provisioning of coffee, which I need to study and finish my assignment or whatever it is, pizza truck, whatever it is. So the environment provides us goods and services. And they're listed up here. And so water regulation, water purification, land that can be used either for agriculture or for conservation habitat. These are various ecosystem services. And if we think about ecosystem services in these terms, we can provide another way, another framework for analysis. Now, I introduced this concept, and we're going to get a little bit into the weeds on ecosystem services. Because in this case, I mentioned before that ecosystem services were the way to talk about this. That the water could either be used for agriculture in the valley, or the water could be used for hydropower, or the water could be used for prawn fisheries downstream. There's a trade-off. And so if we can use ecosystem services as the language that we're going to use to explain the trade-off, we can explain it in fewer words and in shorter terms to inform decision makers. In my perspective, this is super important because it emphasizes where the decision rests, where there are substitutions, and what the options might look like. Because in this case, the do-nothing approach, develop agricultural systems versus U.S. government walks away, the U.S. government walking away in this scenario is not a positive from an environmental standpoint. The no development alternative is not good because it just means that more folks will come into the valley, more poverty will multiply, the resources will continue to be used in an unplanned way, and that's detrimental to these hippos, those elephants, whatever it is that we're looking at. So I steal a quote from my favorite president. That conservation means development as much as it does protection. Because if we are the people who are going to be interested in conservation, we need to be talking to and working with folks in terms that mean something to them. And we need to be able to develop resources so that people have a good quality of life in and around these areas. It's very difficult for us to, here in Boston, or for when I'm down in Washington, to establish what we believe as the best conservation objectives and enforce those down on people. If the people on the ground aren't developing and aren't seeing their quality of life come up, they're going to take action into their own hands and have every right to do so. So the problem is that the devil is in the details. So this is like my favorite executive order that has come out in all time, I think. So this was a little-known executive order that came out focusing on ecosystem services review. And some high-level administration folks said, for all U.S. government activities, we should figure out what the relative trade-offs associated with ecosystem uses are. Essentially mandating the type of analysis that we did in Tanzania to do that more upfront and to do that in a more forward-thinking fashion. So I was excited. It's like, this is fantastic. Like, my dream has come true. For my professors here in the front row, I've been talking about ecosystem services for like 15 years. And the concept is not new. And biologists were thinking about this 20 years ago in terms of how we can communicate conservation values. So this made my day. I was super excited about it because there are a lot of ways that we can get into it. And we can get into more details on it later. But then I came to the realization that the World Bank had actually led on this. And that through their performance standards, several years ago in 2012, they actually said, well, for all of the World Bank money that we're spending for international development projects, big roads, big agricultural schemes, big energy projects, you should do this ecosystem services review too. I was like, all right. So apparently we were supposed to be doing this already. How well is that going? The answer is not well at all. These ecosystem services reviews, judging that only one person could define what ecosystem services are, was a little bit problematic to the international community that focuses on impact assessment. So these performance standards, World Bank reviews, the World Bank utilizes, these are the rules for how you review environmental impacts of various projects. Now, these folks right here, in this paper that was published in 2015, it was a draft in January 2015, I don't remember exactly when it was finally published, but they reviewed, they scanned all of the World Bank projects, and every year the World Bank funds hundreds of projects, 300, 500 projects, it depends on the year. Over the past 3 years, since this performance standard had been updated, since the rules of the game had been updated, only 5 projects had conducted any type of ecosystem service review. And they didn't even do a great job, said the report. They only completed a partial assessment. So this is problematic because this validates the concern that a lot of folks have, that there are a lot of rules and regulations that are super cumbersome for folks to deal with. And ultimately, it's the environmentalists that are preparing these assessments. And if the environmentalists aren't even focused on the rules and focused on incorporating ecosystem services, how are we going to actually make better decisions on this subject over time? And so I have great concern over the executive order that was issued by the administration, only because I've seen all of my clients at U.S. Agency for International Development get super confused by it. Because now we start again, and we have, in addition to a social analysis, a gender analysis, an economic analysis, an ecosystem services review analysis. And it adds one more thing into the project pipeline that we have to focus on. So, for the purposes of education, in terms of how projects actually get done, and where any of you could potentially find a job, I'll talk to you a little bit more about my job. And what I do. I'm what's called an environmental impact assessment specialist, and for any project that the U.S. government does abroad, or that the World Bank funds, or that ICF funds, or African Development Bank funds, and they have to go through an environmental and social impact assessment process. This is the basic due diligence process to make sure that we're mitigating environmental risks, that if we're going to do an agriculture project, that there's enough water for the crops to grow. That if we're going to build a road, that we're not building it in an area that's super prone to landslides. So these are the basic things that, like, you do a ground reality check to mitigate risks so that you can make sure that these projects actually work. It's very easy to sit in a classroom like this. It's very easy to sit in a boardroom in Washington and make decisions about how money can be spent without actually knowing if the project is going to work on the ground. Things can look good on paper, but this is the process that you do to actually look at the economic risks, look at the environmental risks, look at the social risks, and do some analysis and focus on development. So this is where the money that is earmarked and spent all around the world, actually how it gets spent. This is the last check from an environmental and social standpoint on how it gets checked. And sometimes it's super easy. This is an example, this is in South Sudan, and this is where a U.S. Agency for International Development was going to build a little clinic. And you can see the clinic right here. The problem is, though, and you can see where this waste pit is. This is the waste pit. And we're not going to get into, when I do this in other places, we try to identify what the waste products are. That's no fun. But trust me, this stuff is gross and includes body parts. Either way, this health clinic, if you look at this little green patch down here in the left corner, is right adjacent to a little farm. And so from an environmental and social due diligence standpoint, we wanted to make sure that the water that comes from that landfill is not going to trickle down into that farm. This is to prevent basic pathogens from being introduced into the food supply system. This is a pretty easy example to look at and understand. Be like, yeah, let's move the waste pit, or let's move the farm, something like that. And that's like really the basics of international development if we're going to actually build some of the little infrastructure. So sometimes it's super clear, sometimes it's not. So this is a picture of the Keystone XL pipeline. Who's heard of the Keystone XL pipeline? Who can explain to me what the situation was?
Essentially, they wanted to build a pipeline to take tar sands oil from Canada down to the Gulf for refinement, and then shipping it out to other countries. But it was going to go through a bunch of private land and federal land, so it had to get certification by the federal government, and eventually it was denied. So now they're trying to figure out how to repeal.
They're figuring out what to do, right? And so here, this is a means for delivery. The question that we were trying to answer is what's the best means for delivery? There are these tar sands, and good job. What was your name?
Michael.
Michael. So thanks to Michael for explaining this, because basically there are tar sands, there are petroleum resources that can be developed in Canada. The question is how to get them to the global market. They can either come through the U.S. or not. And so the U.S. government did an environmental and social impact assessment. State Department commissioned it to try to answer that question. What are the various environmental impacts associated with this project from a U.S. government standpoint? Now, the problem with this project relates to the scope. When we can think about the issue, if it's just burying a pipeline, we bury pipelines all the time. There are pipelines running out through Frontier Avenue, Tom Ave, all of that stuff. So if it's just the environmental impacts of burying a pipeline, that doesn't seem to be that controversial, right? Where was the controversy?
I was going through an area that has very large diversity and
Yeah. Plan A was let's shortcut this thing through a national park. And then through the impact assessment process, they said, well, wait, maybe we can go around the park. So they did. So they went back to the drawing board. What else was controversial about it? What is the other environmental impact people were concerned about? A spill?
Yeah, we did spill. We pretty much always spill.
Exactly. What else? More head scratching. Go ahead. Risk of explosion was not as big of it, biggest one, but you've got your hand, you're a little shy in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, by building this pipeline, you increase your reliance on fossil fuels.
Yes. Did everybody hear that? By building the pipeline, you're essentially enabling and advancing the use of fossil fuels. Climate change is a big deal these days. And so the question was, are we contributing to fossil fuel consumption and net carbon dioxide increases by okaying this project? And so there are a lot of ways to look at this. What the U.S. government has decided to do is not okay the project, and now Keystone has withdrawn because they're just waiting for the next president to come in. Then they'll try again and see if there's a different attitude or whatever it is. The alternative is that currently those fossil fuels are moving through Canada or through the rail system, which from an environmental impact perspective may lead to greater risk of spills. So it's a question of we need to make a clear decision here, but we also need to bound our decision making so that politicians, so that folks in any administration can make a good and sound decision about it. So we need to decide what's in and what's out. So in terms of bounding the analysis, we can keep it simple, and you saw the little example from South Sudan where there was a little project, that was for a little health clinic. Now, the U.S. government does one-off projects, but the way that we spend money is that we decide we're going to spend $10 million in a country over a period of 4 years or 5 years, because we need to do a lot of things. We need to build roads, we need to build water, we need to develop the water resources, we need to support their agriculture and all of that. Now, when that's done, you can hire a contractor like me. And in this case, we went to Honduras to conduct what's called a programmatic environmental impact assessment. So instead of looking at the one little well or the one little road, we looked at the whole suite of projects that were going to take place in western Honduras. And here the U.S. government was interested in roads, energy development, so hydropower development, transmission, hydropower and transmission, and agriculture projects. And then there was a little bit of democracy and governance stuff that was thrown into the mix there too. So we were brought in to look at this menu of projects. It was like 3 pages of projects, like little descriptions and all of that. So we had to look at the whole basket. And so here, we did all of the analysis, we did some land use change, and I just show a map just to show something. We did all of the analysis, but at the end of the day, the unit of measure that was particularly important and that could be managed, and if AID was really interested in sustainable development and managing economic growth in a way that would be acknowledging what natural resource constraints really were and planning for that, was to focus not on the whole western region as if it was one single part of a map, but to look at it through the lens of a watershed and to do individual watershed planning. And to plan a watershed from top to bottom, sub-watershed I should say, to plan the whole sub-watershed from top to bottom so that you could design roads that would go in through the watershed and map with contours, so that you could use the water resources properly, so that you could protect these protected areas, which are shown in purple, adequately. And so the whole narrative, and this is where I did get it right, where in this analysis we were able to get it down and make a recommendation that the US government is taking to, instead of do just kind of scattershot, shotgun style development in the area, to focus on and pick 6 specific watersheds and focus on the results in that narrow geographic area to get folks out of poverty. And in Honduras, it's particularly important because the threat of drug trafficking is super high in Honduras. Did anybody watch that Netflix show Narcos? Yeah, a lot of headlines. That's what it's like in Honduras now. It's amazing and terrifying. And so what you need to be able to do to get folks out of that personal security situation, to get folks out of a starvation situation, is to focus on the natural resources and talk about it in a way that folks can be empowered. And we've upped the ante. The stakes keep getting higher. What is this a picture of? The agreement in Paris. What happened?
It was the first global agreement to curb the carbon emissions. To say that world war II resources 1.5 to the zero goal. The current INDC agreement is down to like 3.4, but every 5 years there's going to be a revision.
Perfect. Just to reiterate for folks that couldn't hear, the goal was to focus on climate change mitigation and create a solution so that at worst, temperatures do not increase more than 2 degrees Celsius. At best, it will be lower than that. They're going to set revised thresholds, and these folks are happy about it. So the global community is now about to dump tons of money into sustainable development and focus on reducing emissions. And a lot of the money for developing countries is focused on adaptation. This is a good thing. The devil is in the details. And the playing ground is here in Africa. What I failed to mention on that first slide, when it looked at the development goals for the U.S. Agency for International Development and the World Bank, when we're talking about people that are at less than $2 a day, 40% of folks living in sub-Saharan Africa are living on less than $2 a day. And it's something like 25% of folks in Southern Asia are on less than $2 a day. So how will we know if we're successful? This climate change agreement goes great. You know, climate change happens here in this classroom. We turn on the AC a little bit more. We'll make it. My perspective is that we will know in the long run, in 30 years or 50 years, if this agreement was successful and if our development trajectories were successful, based on how Africa develops. And there the stakes are super high. Look back at those pictures of elephants and rhinos and hippos and all of that, and hopefully future generations will be able to see those wild critters the same way that like 15% of this room has. So we're dumping tons of money, tons of energy, and tons of effort into it. This is a snapshot of the U.S. Agency for International Development's website. 2 years ago, they announced, President Obama announced Power Africa, which is the U.S. government's goal to help bring electricity, bring all of these interconnections, and tens of thousands of megawatts of power big projects in some cases. And the World Bank said, hey, US government, good idea. We'll double down on that. We'll throw in a couple $1 billion and we'll help out with that. We're going to fast track development in Africa to get these people out of those $2 a day situations. So if we're just going to look at what's shovel ready and run things really quickly, there's the potential. What kind of projects do we think are furthest along the pipeline and most shovel ready? Any guesses? A lot of them are fossil fuel technology. That's what we're good at. We're good at developing fossil fuel technologies. The other thing that folks are looking at are hydropower projects. The projections are to get the world out of poverty, we will roughly double the hydropower capacity in the world by the year 2030. That's a tremendous amount of money, infrastructure investment, and time that is going to go into this. So this is a picture here, a couple snapshots, some of the statistics. Robert is actually reading the amount of megawatts that are going to be in here. But for the most part, this will give you a good sense of the story. This is a huge river, one of the most powerful rivers in the world that can be dammed to generate electricity that they think could generate enough electricity to send to South Africa, to send to the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, and potentially be enough power if they get the 40,000 megawatts of electricity done right, enough to send some to Europe. Huge power that we're talking about. There's an awesome Red Bull video that shows some idiots kayaking down this river. And if we had more time, I would show you the video. But if you want to follow up, you can check it out. It's pretty cool and pretty impressive, and this is a huge thing. But the environmental impacts of that are tremendous. And this project right here, this Grand Inga project, this isn't even included in those estimates of what the US government is doing and what the World Bank is doing. This is separate from that. We're talking about a tremendous amount of money, time, and effort that's going to be fast-tracked into. We better hope that those environmental analyses that we were talking about are effective and that people can make good decisions real quickly. How do we guarantee sustainable development? This is my answer. Focus on democracy. What does democracy mean? Government by the people, form of government in which supreme power is vested in the people. But we need people to make good decisions. We need people to make decisions that are based on sound information, sound analytics. Not that horrible map that I showed first. I made that map. I didn't make that map. It's the people that helped me with that map. My GIS skills are poor. But we need to focus on information that is accessible. Whether the IR folks in the room, depending on what your goals are in terms of what you would like to see from an international relations standpoint, or for the environmental folks in the room, what you would like to see our world develop like. I think that it comes back to democracy. And it comes back to the information that people have at their fingertips to make a decision when it's time to make a decision. And this is the statistic that blows me away. That 90% of all of the information, data in the world, has come about in the last 2 years. Now for me, this is terrifying because it means that the methodologies that I'm using had better get updated pretty often. Because if I'm not looking for new sources of information, someone else probably is. So we need to up our game in terms of the types of information that we're using, how we're presenting it, and focusing on simplifying and focusing on a crystal clear message so that decision makers who have a tremendous amount of power and influence to power Africa and move this money, make this development real, and we're really serious about solving climate change, if we're really serious about getting people out of poverty, we need to be focusing on utilizing this information to our best advantage and presenting it in really simple ways and marrying separate streams of information. This is an example of sub-Saharan Africa, where on one side we've got a map of the oil fields and where the oil resources can be developed. On the other side, we have conservation zones and elephant habitat. We need to be able to show these quick overlap images so that folks can make decisions in a very quick way that there in fact is a conflict of interest, or that there are trade-offs to a particular development path. That way people can make informed decisions to the greatest extent possible. And so we're doing that. This is a better map that was produced, and it essentially shows where the renewable energy resources are in Senegal. I was doing a project in Senegal that was looking at what are the environmental threats to the country from a forestry standpoint, from a marine fishery standpoint, from an ecosystem health standpoint, and then what are the opportunities? And renewable energy in Senegal is real and meaningful. And here at the U.S. government mission, at the U.S. Embassy, they were struggling because they were under a mandate to spend millions of dollars. Washington was telling them, you need to spend millions of dollars over the next 3 to 5 years on energy projects. And they didn't know what to do. And they didn't know what to spend them on. And so what we did in real fast order was put together a list of the shovel-ready renewable energy projects. Solar, hydro, wind, that they could develop, where the impact assessments had been done, and it looked favorable from an environmental standpoint. We had to hustle as environmentalists to get with the pace of development. So I close with just these two quotes. One from Thomas Jefferson. Information is critical. And then from Thoreau, who wrote this 15 miles away, sitting looking at a pond, is that we can get lost in the details. We need to simplify. And this is something that I work on every single day, and that I work on with my staff, is that if we're going to really influence decision makers, we have tremendous analytic capabilities. We have tremendous data and resources available to us. All of that is for nothing if we're just talking between the two of us. We can't reach a broad audience. So that's my opinion on sustainable development, what we need to be doing. I'd be happy to answer any questions on this. Jamie did mention that I'm running for Congress in Northern Virginia. If you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. But we've got 20 minutes left or something.
Any questions?
So go ahead.
I have a question. I want you to comment on the role of China. So we have a project here at GU looking at Cambodia. So China is bringing hydroelectric power dams upon a Mekong, and we do the same thing in ecosystem services. We're modeling the future, looking at climate scenarios and so on. And China is gotten in a big way all over Africa and Latin America. And their banks are much bigger than the world.
Sure.
I want you to comment on it.
That's a good point. So Professor Gopal's question was, what's the role of China on the global stage, and where am I seeing it? So I talked a little bit about Power Africa. So this is a U.S. government effort that came out 2 years ago, I forget the exact timing of it. This was in response to China, in the fewest words possible. President Obama and the administration realized that China was investing in Africa in a huge way. You drive, and this is, Professor Baldwin and I were talking earlier, if you drive on a nice road in Africa, built by the Chinese. And that's where, from a geopolitical standpoint, the U.S. government realized we were way behind, and got with the program and focused on real investment. Now, the environmental folks have great concern about that, because I mentioned this environmental social impact assessment process. That was born from the National Environmental Policy Act, signed in 1970. Richard Nixon, this is back when Republicans were environmentalists. So this was signed back in the day, and formed the regulatory framework for this environmental due diligence process. The World Bank has a very similar process, and it's employed on these big projects. Now, that takes time, and it takes money, to go through those environmental safeguards. The US government has very high safeguards. The World Bank probably has higher safeguards. But the US government and the US government and the World Bank aren't spending nearly as much as China. And China knows what it's doing from a geopolitical standpoint because they're willing to spend their money faster and do less on those environmental and social impact assessment processes. So if you're a developing country and you're working with the United States, I'm like, yeah, I like the United States, but China said they'll do this like 3 months faster, and my people they're like really starving, really poor, really need help, really need this road. It's a decision that those, developing country presidents make all the time, and a lot of times they favor China.
The same thing that happened. All the oil pipelines in the eastern Europe are going to be taken over by China. They're doing some deal in Canada. Then they're ready to
Yeah, China's happy to fund it. Any other questions? You had a question.
Yeah, a lot of critics were skeptical about the Paris Agreement because it's not an enforceable treaty, and it already hit a stumbling block when the Supreme Court ruled that Obama's administration didn't have the authority to take decisive action.
Right.
So what's your outlook on, or what's your opinion on the outlook of the agreement, specifically with the U.S.'s ability to lead the way through hindered by Congress?
Sure. So to catch everyone up, and the essence of the question is how real is this Paris Agreement? Because folks were in Kyoto and they signed another agreement. It seems like the presidents all get together once in a while. They make bold declarations and nothing comes of it. I don't know. I think it depends on what Congress is able to do here in the United States, and it depends on where federal governments, state governments, and local governments make their decisions. Here in the U.S., we've seen an incredible amount of leadership at the local level, City of Boston, in terms of identifying renewable, sources. So what the U.S. government does has a major role. What the state of California does too. And that's where the New England states, California, have their various cap and trade agreements set in place. And so they will be working towards those agreements almost regardless of what the U.S. federal government does. Very specifically, part of the reason that I'm running for Congress is because I think that we're not going to see anything done at the national level on climate change from a mitigation standpoint until Republicans do it. We've had 8 years of a Democratic president. 2 of those years, Democrats were in control, and they made a valiant effort on cap and trade, and it failed, and we haven't seen anything since. So what President Obama did is he, through regulation, signed what's called the Clean Power Plant rule, which would force states to take action. And the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, stopped that. Said, listen, a bunch of states are pretty upset about this. We need to let the lower courts decide it. So that's basically on timeouts. The U.S. government actually looks bad on the global stage because the president said we were going to do this, signed an order, and then the Supreme Court checked his power and said, no, we're not going to do that. So one of the reasons that I'm running for Congress is I believe that climate change is real. I'm running for the Republican nomination. I'll get that nomination this coming Saturday. And then we'll actually be able to have, I'm pretty optimistic, I'm more optimistic. We will be able to have a serious conversation about what we're going to do to address climate change here in the United States. I'm an economist. I'm an ecologist. I believe in markets, and I believe in a cap and trade system. My opponent that I'm running against in November, or that I will run against in November, is a firm believer in a carbon tax. And so we'll have an opportunity to discuss what is the best approach in a real open and meaningful way. And my hope is that me running as a Republican will create some bandwidth for other Republicans to get on board. And the truth is that I've been running in this primary process, and I'm getting a lot of support. Because folks get it. They understand that climate change is real and that we need to do something about it. Folks get this is the future that we're talking about. And that's where the Republicans that are in Congress and have stymied these efforts in the past are not accurately representing the voice of the American people. And so you see a lot of turmoil in the Republican Party itself, not just on this issue. It hasn't really come up on this issue, but it's come up on other issues, and we can talk about that too. Go ahead.
So are they going to build the Keystone Pipeline now that oil is $45 a barrel? Was this another example of environmentalists who
it's certainly possible. So that's where the question is: if the price of oil is so low, I mean, is it still economically, feasible? So it's possible that this project would have been stopped, even from an economic, standpoint. So no, I don't know the answer to that question. And at a minimum, what we did is we had a very open and democratic discussion about it, and it's thanks to that environmental and social impact assessment process that's required by law. And it only works if we actually have these discussions out in the open, if people are informed about what the pros and cons are. I don't know, probably not. From an economic standpoint, there are other ways to do it. Go ahead.
I found it interesting earlier when you were talking about the way to achieve the development successful through democracy.
Sure.
But and actually when you asked that, I actually kind of wanted to say something along the lines of that. But do you agree that because many of those countries in Africa don't have absolute democratic governments, you believe that that will limit the possibility of achieving these projects that or this economic success, right? Because I'm still trying to word this right. Because like mostly when you invest in a lot of these African countries, a lot of money mismanaged, and the resources are mismanaged, and there's a lot of corruption.
Yeah.
So do you think because there's not absolute democracy in a lot of these countries that will hinder the possibility of future development success in the country?
Sure. So the question for the benefit of the room is, short of an absolute democracy, is this dream of sustainable development even possible? To answer your question, and so that's where, if you look at there are all these different freedom indexes and democracy indexes and whatever it is, U.S. government is sort of high, not at the top, and by rule, a lot of the African countries are substantially lower on that democracy and freedom angle. So the question is my answer is it's relative. In the United States, we've got a democracy. How happy are we with the presidential frontrunners right now? It's all a little bit. It's relative, but it's where so it's focusing on democracy in terms of how it was defined there on the board, and in terms of providing people with information and people making decisions, because that's where it's only if the people, the masses, have access to easy information that they can influence their leaders. The common joke is that the only purpose of a politician is to get reelected, right? The only way you get reelected is if you have some support from the people. And so if the people are educated and informed, I believe that it can be very organic. And that's where the challenge is on us as folks who are interested in international development, or interested in conservation, to present the information in a way that makes sense to folks. Go ahead.
I think in terms of democracy, there's a missing word here, which is institutions. That's the key word, again, based on a bunch of books that come out lately. And obviously, nothing worse than good institutions that actually work in democracy. Second point is incentives. For a lot of projects to work, there must be some, hopefully, ground level incentives, and I don't mean bribes.
Yeah.
That's it. 2 points.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, so, in class, especially while we're talking a lot about this, and in other classes, just much of other classes, we're talking about how, as countries get richer, environmental issues become more important. So for a lot of these people that are living like $2 a day, it's tough for them to see the 20 or 30 years in the future when it's, sustainable, hosting ways to provide for real for the next day or the next meal. How do you convince those people that, instead of bringing about just tomorrow, that they're making very long-term timeline of what needs to happen?
Sure. So the question is basically, and let me know if I'm getting this right, but how do you factor in environment when folks a lot of times have a very near-term focus on economic development? You focus on economic development. And then you focus on economic development because, the idea of going to visit Africa and go on safari, check out an elephant, totally falls by the wayside if I'm hungry. Or I'm worried about my family's economic opportunity here in Massachusetts or wherever. And so that's where you need to focus on development and have it be both at the same time. So focusing on the three pegs of the stool, which are economic development, social development, and environmental, natural resource conservation, and good management. Go ahead. Sorry.
So, question kind of, how long is
So where is it?
like on the primary photo, the one here?
No, go ahead.
So, there's issues where there's been a lot of conflict because of the war. People really listen a lot of over. So you say, like, we focus on economic development, so I guess center. At the same time, as they're realistic workers, they're also taking away from their livestock and their profit and something important wildlife.
Yeah.
Because the wildlife harms their profit, they eat their profit when they migrate to the next part. So I don't understand
So to repeat the question, so the question was, and you were using an example from which country is it? It's in Tanzania. So it's just another spot in Tanzania where there's human-wildlife conflict, and the nut of the issue is that the problem is the people, and that we're not going to have conservation of any of the beautiful animals or whatever it is if there are just too many people. And this is where the scale and the scope of the analysis really does matter. Now, and this is a great ivory tower statement that I'm about to make. The truth of the matter is that raising livelihoods in this area, to get these poor farmers to be living any real quality of life is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And the truth is that they will have more economic opportunity if they leave the valley and go to Dar es Salaam or go somewhere else. And that's when we can have more efficient agricultural production in that valley and enough space for the wildlife and enough space for the watersheds to get recharged so that that water can flow downriver so that they can have hydropower that will power Dar es Salaam and have enough water for the prawn fisheries. So this is where you need to look at the scope of the analysis. But how do you get there at the end of the day? How do you get the people to move out of the valley? Well, you need a road, and then you need to have their incomes raised just enough so that they can get on the road and go someplace where they can have a better economic livelihood and take that pressure off the land. Now, we need to do that without being very top-down about it. You can't just take people and move them. That's not ever desirable. We need to create the economic conditions and incentives so that people can make decisions on their own in that democratic way that we were talking about and decide where to live. But we as development professionals, urban planners, environmental folks, need to have that vision in mind as it relates to these short-term projects. Go ahead, you had your hand and I passed you.
So you mentioned,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the value of information, right, and how important it is that we get information to the public. But we've been releasing IPCC reports since 1990, right? And so our Congress hasn't actually come around, two-thirds of our public hasn't come around to the idea of climate change until much more recently. And I think that in large part that's because of sustained efforts to kind of, to either suppress that information, to suppress its dissemination, or to present alternative misinformation from a lot of the industries that have major stakes in, this issue. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that and, what we as scientists or what we as people can do about that particular problem.
Sure. How many people, so you were talking about the IPCC reports. How many people have read an IPCC report? Okay. How many people, know about climate change? Okay. Almost everyone. No one reads those IPCC reports because they're a horrible read. That will put you to sleep. Wow. And so, how do these folks in the room learn about climate change? From somewhere else, not the IPCC. It's from someone that's doing some other analyses, aggregating the information, presenting it in a more meaningful way. The IPCC were focused on communications a little bit better. focused on the masses a little bit more, shortening up some of those reports, tightening up an executive summary, and creating some beautiful facts and figures that I can share on Facebook, we might be having a different conversation. Now, hindsight is 20/20. Well, that's my point, is that we need to step up our game as development professionals, as environmentalists, as number crunchers. I can make a lot of graphs that are beautiful to me and beautiful to my faculty, my professor friends, but don't mean anything to anybody else. We always run that risk. And so that's maybe the goal and maybe a great way to end this, is to just focus on simplifying and focus on communications and focus on broadening the audience. And this is the constant challenge that I see in my job. Thank you all for your time.